Hello everyone, my name is Sarah, and today we are going to be using the Shopkins Shoppies doll to make the character Hilda from the graphic novel series and the Netflix show of the same name. Normally, this is where I would cut off a doll's hair, but not this time. Her hair is already the perfect color, so we're just going to leave it alone for now. I removed the doll's factory paint with acetone-based nail polish remover. Instead of using a Q-tip though, I used one of my washcloths that I use when painting. I'm trying to be more environmentally conscious with my doll making, and this is one way to reduce waste. After rinsing her face with gentle soap and warm water, I started working to remove the bow molded onto her chest. I started with an X-Acto knife and tried to carve away at it. Then I switched to a Dremel, but the plastic was too hard, so back to the X-Acto knife I went. I cut very slowly and carefully. This footage is sped up almost 1000%. Once most of the bow was gone, I brought back out the Dremel and did my best to smooth out the remaining pieces that might snag on her clothes. Using references from the TV show, since that's the version of Hilda I'm most familiar with, I got to work on her face. While her eyes were drying, I mixed up a paint to match her skin tone. I used it to cover her pink torso. It won't show under her clothes, but it makes her look neater overall. The lines around her eyes were tricky. I struggled to make them not too thick but not too thin, and they couldn't be too short or too long either. Not to mention, the color value difference between white and black made it hard to paint over mistakes on the white paint, especially since the acrylic was watered down. This was my first time making a character look to the side, but But it was a good choice. Less chance for her to look derpy, or wall-eyed, I think. I gave some shading to her eyes to make them look like they had more dimension than they did. There's less of an eye mold with these dolls than Monster High, and not only does that make placement tricky, but the dolls need a little more help to have a lifelike appearance. I used a kneaded eraser to remove the excess pastel, or what of it I could. I found that the sealant I used wouldn't give up all of the pastels, no matter how much I erased. Hilda is a young child, so I wasn't going to give her any makeup, but I did want her to look a little flushed, like she'd been running around outside on an autumn day. So she got a little pink on her cheeks and nose. It was hard to remove excess here as well, and I had to try multiple times to make her look flushed, not feverish. The pastels shading her eyes also highlight the streakiness of the paint, something I wasn't happy with, but I kept pushing on. Going into this project, I assumed it would be quick and easy. It's a smaller doll, she's keeping her factory hair, it'll be a breeze, right? Wrong. Every part of her face was a challenge. In the end, I wiped it off. Painful, but also satisfying. With a clean slate once again, I started over. I worked hard to keep my paint fluid and thin, which kept it from leaving visible streaks on the scleras like last time. I accepted nothing less than what I knew I was capable of, so I still had to retry her eyes twice or so before moving on. I did her mouth and eyebrows off camera. Sometimes you just have to get your face right up to the doll, and that's no good for filming. Once her face was complete, I added the first layer of pastels for shading. They stuck very well, even though I hadn't used any sealant to prime the face. This made the pastels more workable, and I was able to remove them with my eraser much more easily. I also made the shading much less dramatic, more subtle. There's only so much you can suggest when the doll's face is pretty much flat. Her second face-up was a success. Only using sealant on top of the face kept it from getting the dirty, grungy look the first one had. I don't use MSC, so I used a makeup sponge to gently apply 2 layers of matte varnish on top. Then, of course, I glossed her eyes. Next came her shoes. I initially wanted to take her shoes and build on them to make the rain boots that Hilda wears, so I broke out the air dry clay and did my best. But when I put them on her feet, they cracked. I couldn't get the clay to stop caving in on itself as it dried and making the opening for her feet too narrow. Slightly frustrated, but still optimistic, I tried again. I really didn't want to have to make paper mache casts and build my own boots, so I tried to figure out a way to make polymer clay tops for the shoes. I tried cling wrap and aluminum foil. Neither worked. I even tried looking at the melting point of the type of plastic her shoes were to see if I could bake them. I couldn't, and you shouldn't either. But I stopped. I gave up. I made paper mache casts. I was still a little freaked out by Chris's first round of shoes being too small last time, so I made sure there was plenty of foil bulking up her leg before I started the casts. I made the rain boots using, once again, watercolors' tutorial for a jumping off point. I made sure to trim them down to the right size, though, before baking to avoid the cracks I ended up with last time. Once baked, I sanded them smooth and painted them red, again using a makeup sponge. I bought a pack of makeup applicators as reusable alternatives to Q-tips for when a cloth won't work. I promise that's just paint on my finger from the previous boot. The next stage was making her clothes. I pulled apart her skirt to make her one that was more accurate to her character. I traced the fabric to make a pattern and cut out my new skirt. Then I fray checked all of the edges to keep them from unraveling. I sewed by hand the top edge folded over to make a loop that would be the waistband. I cut a piece of elastic the same length as the one in the original skirt. One end I attached to a stitch marker, but you can use a safety pin. This keeps it from slipping through the other end. Then I threaded a needle and sewed it to the other end of the elastic. I tied the 2 thread ends together, forming a loop. Then I pushed the needle through the waistband of the skirt, blunt end first. You will have to stretch the elastic to make both ends visible at the same time. Safety pin both ends together to keep from losing them. Remove the needle and thread. Sew the two ends together securely and then seam up the sides of the rectangle. Now you have a cute little gathered skirt. Next was her sweater. I decided to knit it, and I dyed the yarn the same way I did in the raw save video, with food coloring. Her scarf was a little bit trickier. I tried several different yarns and color combinations until I got the exact shade I wanted. Once I had all of the sweater pieces knit up, I soaked them in soapy water several times until they stopped bleeding dye. Red dyes tend to do this, and even though I rinsed the yarn before knitting with it, it still turned my fingers bright pink. You don't want this to happen to your doll or their clothes. While they soaked, I searched through my buttons until I found a few small ones that would work to hold the back of the sweater closed. Hilda wears what are either black tights or leggings, and I decided to try using a Sharpie to stain her legs black. Unfortunately, it just scraped off, having not actually stained the plastic. It just covered it like paints do. Off camera, I made her a pair of leggings, which ended up helping her boots to stay on as well. The last bit was her beret. I cut out two of the same circles and sewed them right sides together around the edges. I left only a small hole through which I turned it right sides out and stuffed it using some of the yarn scraps left over from her sweater and scarf. Then I sewed the rest of it shut, successfully doing the ladder stitch for the first time ever. I decided to use one of my sewing pins to hold her beret on her head and function as the tassel. The ball end I colored with a Sharpie as well. Thankfully, the ink stuck to the pinhead better than it did to her legs. Now it was time to do her hair. I had thoroughly washed it before beginning the customization, which helped, but there were still some scraggly bits that had to be dealt with. Those I cut off quickly and without much precision. I didn't have any Sharpie-sized stands, so I had to rubber band her to a monster high one. She kind of looked possessed when she was in that position. Hilda doesn't really have this type of bangs, but cutting them off altogether wouldn't have looked good, so I trimmed them a bit and left them as they were. Then I started the process of trimming her hair to the right length down her back. I took care to do it bit by bit rather than just whacking off a bunch at once and then realizing it was too short. final part was to make her loyal companion, Twig. I bought a Littlest Pet Shop toy that looked a bit like the adorable deer fox and got to work. I wasn't sure what type of plastic Twig was, so I started with acetone-free nail polish remover, but that only took off some of the paint. Carefully, I tried out the 100% acetone, and thankfully, it didn't seem to melt him. I didn't work at it too hard though, better safe than sorry. Once he was all clean, he got a new coat of paint, or rather, several new coats of paint. It took a few layers to get to a point where that pink wasn't peeking through. Once the white was solid and smooth, on went the details. His eyes, his nose, his hooves, and his spots. Next were his antlers. I made armatures for them out of a paper clip and from some wire inside a twist tie. Then I poked holes in his head using a needle. I formed the bottoms of the antlers while the wires were still in the head so that they would be flush with it when glued back on. I removed the wires and made the rest of the antlers out of polymer clay before I baked them. Once they were baked, I painted them and superglued them into their holes. It was time to put everything together. I got a chance to take some great pictures of Hilda and Twig out in the woods while visiting some family. A lot of the show takes place in the woods, so it was perfect. I really hope that Netflix makes a second season of Hilda, and I cannot wait to read some of the books that started it all. I hope you all enjoyed and have found your way to my new channel, because I have lots of customs in the works. So like and subscribe if you want, and you can also now support me on Ko-fi. The link will be in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you're having an excellent day. Bye!